Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on tips for quantitative survey research. Just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to give you this contact information in case you're interested in additional support beyond this webinar. I do provide services for assistance with all parts of the dissertation, so if you are interested in more one-on-one help, outside of this webinar, you can use this contact information to learn more about what services that we provide. So before we begin, let's just go over an overview of what we'll be covering in the presentation today. So first, we will talk about selecting the appropriate instruments for a quantitative survey study. And then we'll talk a little bit about online versus face-to-face surveys and which may be the most appropriate to use. And then we'll talk about specific tips for constructing your survey with the focus on constructing online surveys. We'll also talk about tips for administering your survey, so your actual data collection stage. And then finally, we'll briefly talk about special considerations for repeated measures or longitudinal studies. And then at the end, we'll have time to answer any questions that you might have. So we will have that opportunity for questions at the end. You are welcome to type your questions into the question section. And then at the end of the presentation, if the question is not answered over the course of the presentation, we will answer those questions at the end. Okay, so first let's talk about selecting the appropriate instruments for doing an online survey study. So in order to do a survey study, you need to select survey instruments for measuring all of the variables that you intend to measure. And so the first thing that you'll want to do is go back to your problem, purpose, and research questions and identify all of the variables of interest in your study. So you want to make sure that in your survey, you have instruments or questions that measure all of the variables that are laid out in your research questions and described in your problem and purpose statements. So for instance, if we have the research question, is transformational leadership correlated with job satisfaction after controlling for age, gender, and ethnicity, then we need to make sure that our survey contains instruments or questions that measure all of those variables mentioned in the research question. So we would need an instrument that measures transformational leadership. We would need an instrument that measures job satisfaction. And we would need questions or instruments that measure participants' age, gender, and ethnicity. You want to make sure that you go back to your research question, problem, and purpose and identify all of the variables that you have in your study, and then make sure that you obtain instruments or have questions in your survey that address all of those variables. And so once you have that list of all the variables that you need to measure for your study, then it becomes a matter of finding appropriate instruments to measure those variables. So where should you look for those? And the answer is you should be looking in your theoretical framework and articles from your literature review to find the appropriate instruments to measure those variables. You really want to find instruments that have already been established and validated in the literature and used by other researchers to measure the variables of interest. You really want to avoid having to create your own instrument to measure a variable, because instrument creation and development can be a study in and of itself and is generally not really appropriate for a dissertation where other things are the focus. So you really want to avoid creating your own instrument if possible, and use instruments that have already been created and vetted by other researchers. And so the best place to find these instruments that have already been established are in the literature. So you can look to your literature review and see for articles that discuss each variable, what survey instruments have been used by past researchers to measure those variables. And oftentimes, if your variables come from a specific theoretical framework, that specific theory might have a very specific instrument associated with it that measures the central variables. So that's often the best place to look to find the most appropriate instrument for your study. And just some things to keep in mind when you are finding and selecting instruments from the literature to use in your study is that first you want to make sure that you're able to obtain the complete instrument and scoring information for each instrument that you have. So you want to make sure that you're able to obtain the full set of questions and the information on how to score those questions in order to use the survey properly. I've seen situations where a student tried to get a survey but didn't get the complete survey. It was only just a sample of the survey questions. And then they did their entire study and data collection not using all of the survey questions, and it caused a lot of problems for them. So you want to make sure you avoid a situation like that and make sure that when you find an instrument that you're able to obtain the full set of questions or items for the instrument and that you obtain the scoring information as well. And for this reason, you may want to consider identifying at least one or two backup instruments in case the primary instrument that you find to measure the variable you're not able to use for some reason. So, maybe you can't get the full set of questions, maybe you're not able to get in touch with the instrument authors or the company that distributes the instrument. For whatever reason, if your first choice for the instrument, you're not able to obtain that instrument, then you want to make sure that you have some backup instruments that measure the same variable that you could potentially use in case you're not able to move forward with your first choice. So now that we've talked about selecting the appropriate instruments for an online survey study, let's talk about the issue of online versus face-to-face surveys. So it's becoming increasingly preferable to conduct surveys online for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons is right now, due to current conditions, it may not really be easy or possible to contact people face-to-face or conduct surveys in face-to-face settings. So it's becoming increasingly common to conduct surveys online, and also there's an added convenience of conducting surveys online. However, if you feel like you need to conduct surveys in a face-to-face setting, there are limitations associated with that that you should be aware of. So when you conduct surveys face-to-face, the main limitations of that are that you have less control over how participants respond, and you have issues where data entry errors can occur. So when you conduct a survey face-to-face and participants are completing the survey in a paper and pencil format, you can't really, it's harder to put measures in place to make sure that participants answer the survey correctly. So for instance, if you're giving the participant a multiple choice question where you only want them to select one answer. If they're filling it out in paper and pencil, maybe they will select more than one answer, and there's not really a way to prevent them from doing that. Also, if you have any sections of your survey that require participants to enter a free response, like write in a number for something, like their age, for instance, you could run into issues where maybe the answer that the participant wrote down is illegible, like you can't read their handwriting or you can't tell what answer they put down. So with face-to-face surveys, sometimes you have that ambiguity in the participants' responses. And another limitation of face-to-face surveys is that errors can occur during data entry. So when you conduct a paper and pencil survey, an additional step that you'll always have to do is converting those paper and pencil responses to a digital format so that you can conduct a data analysis on it. And so errors can occur when you're entering the responses from the paper and pencil surveys into a digital format. So you could maybe enter in the wrong number or wrong response just by accident as you're transferring the responses from paper and pencil to an electronic spreadsheet. So data entry errors like that can occur when you are using face-to-face surveys. Whereas if you're doing a survey that's online, the data and responses will automatically be saved in a digital format, and so you don't even have the step of having to do data entry. So you eliminate the possibility of data entry errors by doing an online survey. And so those are just some considerations to be aware of if you do have to do a survey face-to-face. But as I said, it's probably in your best interest to conduct your survey online if possible. And if you are going to do your survey online, you'll need to choose an online survey hosting service that meets the needs of your study. And there are a couple of different options for this. Many students choose to go with a dedicated professional online survey service such as SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. These are the two most popular online survey services, and they're the most popular because they provide a good number of options for constructing surveys with complex question formats or survey logic. So they're really good for both simple surveys, and if your survey has more complex questions associated with it, these services can handle those types of questions. And also these specific services offer separately data collection services. So if you're stuck and you don't know how you're going to identify and contact and recruit participants for your study, SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics are options that also offer recruitment services. However, the downside to SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics is that they do require fees for their services. So they'll require fees for survey hosting and for participant recruitment. So that's something to consider. There are other options though. So for instance, Google Forms is a free service if all you need is a Google account, and you can use Google Forms for free to set up simple surveys. The downside to Google Forms is that the options for response formats and survey logic are not as complex as what SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics offer. So if you're doing a very complex survey, then Google Forms might not work. for you, but if you're doing something relatively simple, then Google Forms could be an option. All right, so now let's kind of get into the meat of the discussion of constructing your survey. So here we'll go over specific tips for constructing the different parts of your survey and setting up your survey questions. And the main focus of this will be towards constructing the survey for an online format. However, a lot of these things can also apply to a paper and pencil survey. And I'll also be showing some examples or screenshots showing survey construction in specific online formats, and I'll be showing screenshots specifically from SurveyMonkey. So just for that information, the screenshots you see will be from SurveyMonkey for their online survey creation. And so the first thing to start with when constructing your survey is the consent form. So the informed consent form should always be the first thing that participants see when they enter your study. They should see the consent form before they're presented with any other questions, because they need to be able to read the consent information and make an informed decision about whether or not to participate in the study and continue on answering questions. And in an online survey, the consent form is normally just presented as the first page or section of the survey. So when participants click the link or follow the link to go to your online survey, the consent form should be the very first page that comes up. And so your consent form will contain all of the study information, and it should also include an item at the end of the page that participants must endorse to indicate that they consent to participate. So it'll just be an item where they choose, yes, I agree to participate, or no, I do not agree to participate. And so you can set up your survey to where if participants choose yes, then they can continue on with the rest of the questions. And if they choose no, then they would just be disqualified from the study or taken to the end of the survey, thanking them for their time. So if they don't agree to the consent form, then they wouldn't move on to answer any other questions. And then also, before you present any of your instruments, you also want to include eligibility screening questions. So these would be questions that assess whether participants are qualified or eligible to participate in your study based on your study's inclusion or exclusion criteria. So for instance, if you are doing a study specifically on nurses who have, for instance, a specific number of years of experience or who work in a specific area of nursing, you would want to have eligibility questions at the beginning that assess whether participants meet those qualifications. And like the consent form, you can set up those questions to where if they do meet the qualifications, then they're able to continue on with the rest of the questions in the survey. And if they don't meet the qualifications, then they can be disqualified from the study. So you don't waste their time in having them answer any additional questions if they aren't eligible. And then finally, if you have other demographic questions that you want to include in your survey, so basic demographics like age, gender, ethnicity, those types of questions are normally placed either near the very beginning of the survey or they could go at the very end of the survey. And so now let's get into some specific tips for setting up your survey questions. And the first tip that I have is to make sure that you have instructions presented for each instrument or section of your survey. you don't just want to present participants with a set of items or questions without any instructions associated with them. Because although it may seem obvious and intuitive to you how the questions should be answered, it may not be the same for a participant who isn't familiar with your study. So you want to make sure that you provide appropriate instructions for each section of the survey so that participants can answer the questions appropriately. And so you see here in this example, we have a set of instructions that precede the set of questions that tell participants to read each statement carefully and decide if they ever feel this way. And then it provides more information about the different response options and what they mean. So it gives participants an idea of how they can answer the questions. So you do just want to make sure that each section of your survey and really each specific instrument that you're using has its own set of instructions. And often the instrument, if you're using an instrument that has already been created in previous literature, when you obtain that instrument, it should come with a set of instructions that you can just put right into the survey. The next tip that I have is that you should use the required response option whenever possible. So in an online survey, you can mark questions as required, which means that if participants miss a question or skip a question before they're able to move on with the rest of the survey will alert them that they have missed the question and they won't be able to continue until they provide a response to that question. And you really want to use this option as much as possible to make sure you reduce missing data. So there are a lot of reasons why a participant may miss or skip a question. A lot of times it could be that they just miss it by accident. So they might just accidentally skip over a question, especially if there's a lot of questions on a page. And so using this required response option for all of the questions will mean that you will greatly reduce the number of missing responses that you have because participants won't be able to continue until they provide answers to all of those questions. So do make sure that you use this option as much as possible. My next tip is to use matrix response options for sets of Likert type questions. So in a lot of survey instruments, you'll have Likert type questions that come in groups. So maybe you have one instrument that consists of 10 Likert type questions that are answered on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so if you have a set of Likert type questions that use the same Likert response scale for all of the questions, you can set up those questions as a matrix type response format, which is what you see here, where on the left you see you have the statements for the different items or questions, and then across each row you have the Likert response options. And this will just help in terms of the time it takes to construct your survey. So setting up these questions, especially if you have a lot of Likert questions, like 10, 20 plus questions in a set of Likert items, as you set up your survey, using the matrix option will make it faster and easier for you to create those questions. And it will also make it easier and more intuitive for participants to answer these questions. So definitely use the matrix option as much as you can when you have Likert type data. My next tip is to use validation options for free response questions. So you may have questions in your survey that require participants to type in some sort of response, whether it's a word or a number, and they're not just picking from a list of options. So for instance, a question like that might be age. If you're asking participants to enter in their age, then you want to make sure that they enter in a valid number for their age. And for these free response type questions, you can implement data validation to make sure that the responses that participants enter are in the correct format. So for instance, for a question that asks for their age, you can set up the validation options so that participants can only enter whole numbers that fall within a certain range. So that way you don't have participants typing in incorrect formats or typing in their the numbers out in words or something like that. So you get the responses in the correct format. So definitely use the validation options if you have any free response type questions. My next tip, and this is a pretty big one, is to avoid check all that apply type questions whenever possible and use multiple choice format instead. So the difference between multiple choice and check all that apply is that in multiple choice, you give participants a set of choices and participants are only able to select one choice from that set of choices. They can only select one answer. So for instance, if you're asking participants gender and you give them the choices of female and male, you generally only want them to be able to select either female or male, and you don't want them to select more than one option. However, the check all that apply format, you give participants a set of options and they can select any number of the choices that are available. This might be appropriate if you're asking a question such as, what forms of media do you use to get information about politics? And then you might give them options like, websites, online newspapers, print newspapers, television, and they can select any number of those. However, most of the time, and for most types of instruments that you'll be using in quantitative survey research, you'll want to use the multiple choice option instead. Because in most cases, you're just asking questions where you just want participants to select one option for each question. And so definitely avoid using the check all that apply type response for question formats where you only want participants to select one answer. And in general, avoid check all that apply type questions unless they're absolutely necessary, because the check all that apply type questions can create a lot of problems when you're doing data cleaning and analysis. They're much more difficult to work with than the multiple choice format. So this is just something to keep in mind, that whenever possible, you want to use the multiple choice option and not the check all that apply option. And the easy way to tell the difference between these two response formats when you actually implement your survey is that the multiple choice response format will always have circles as the selection buttons that go next to each answer choice. And the check all that apply format will have square check boxes next to each answer choice. So that's a way that you can tell the difference when you actually look at how the survey appears. And now here are just some final considerations for creating your survey questions and setting up your survey. First, you want to make sure that you enter in all of the questions or items for all of your instruments. This goes back to making sure that you have the full set of items or questions for each survey instrument that you are using, and making sure that you put all of those items into the survey. You don't want to leave out any items. And you also want to make sure that all of the items follow the correct format or response scale. So you want to double check, and if you have, for instance, Likert items, you want to make sure that the number of points on the Likert scale is correct. So if the instrument says you should use a 5-point scale, you want to make sure that there are 5 points. And you want to make sure that each of the points on the scales are labeled correctly. So you just want to make sure for each question, for each instrument, that the response format is correct. And then finally, if you have any specific grouping variables that you are interested in, you want to make sure you include questions in the survey that would indicate group membership. So for instance, if you are conducting a survey where you're comparing the responses of principals and teachers, you need a way to be able to tell which participants are the principals and which participants are the teachers. And so the simplest way to do that is to include a question in your survey that asks participants if they are a principal or if they are a teacher. So you want to make sure that you build that into your survey so that you can correctly group participants together. Because if your research questions and your study involves comparing those two groups, you don't want to get to the end of your data collection and realize that you don't know which responses or which participants are the principals and which participants are the teachers. So you want to make sure you include a question in your survey that asks that. So now let's go into some considerations and tips for administering your survey. So once you actually get to the point when your survey's finished and you're getting ready to send it off to participants. So the first thing you want to do is to double check your survey for any mistakes before you send it to participants. So you want to specifically, check for typos, in the questions and the instructions, check for missing questions, check for correct survey logic. And by survey logic, I mean making sure that the survey works the way it is supposed to. So for instance, going back to the consent form, you want to make sure that, when participants click that agree button, they're able to move on with the rest of the survey. And if they click the disagree button, then they are removed from the study. And the same thing with the eligibility questions. You want to make sure that if participants indicate that they meet the eligibility criteria for your study, that they are presented with the rest of the questions, and if they don't, then they are disqualified from the study. You want to make sure that all of that survey logic works correctly. And you also want to double check and make sure that your survey works on multiple computers or devices, specifically if you're doing an online survey. So you, if possible, maybe send the survey link to a colleague and have them try to open the survey to make sure it works for them, or try opening the survey in different web browsers to make sure it works in all types of web browsers. You just want to double check and make sure that your survey is working correctly. And then this next tip, which may seem obvious, but it's very important, is that before you collect any data or send the survey to participants, you want to make sure that you have all of the proper approvals in place to conduct your study. So at bare minimum, this would mean that you have approval from your institutional review board or IRB to collect the data. And you also want to make sure that if you have any other approvals for your study, so specific site approvals, if you are conducting your study in a specific place or with a specific population that requires special approval, then you want to make sure that that is all approved before you collect the data. My next tip here is about sending survey reminders. So a lot of times you will need to send reminders out to participants to take your survey, but you want to do this judiciously. You don't want to bombard your participants with constant survey reminders because this will actually turn participants off to your survey and have the opposite effect of what you want. So you do want to have a schedule in place where you're sending reminders to participants, especially if the data collection is going slowly, but you don't want to send so many reminders that you're turning participants off to your study and harassing your participants with a bunch of reminders. So make sure that you do the reminders in a judicious or reasonable way. So it may be reasonable to send, a reminder, a week or 2 weeks after you send the initial study invitation, or sending a reminder once a week. And oftentimes when you are setting up your methodology section, you will specifically describe the procedure that you'll follow for sending out survey reminders. And then finally, you want to keep your committee members or chair informed about your progress throughout your data collection. So you want to be transparent with them and keep them updated on how your data collection is going. So if data collection is going slow, or just the number of participants that you have, or if you're running into any issues with the data collection, you want to keep them informed throughout the process. Because if you do encounter issues such as not getting enough responses or any other issues with the survey, they can help guide you on what to do. So they can give you some advice on what to do if you're not getting enough participants, whether you should continue on with the data collection, whether you should just stop the data collection and continue on with the number of participants that you have, or if you need to do something different with your data collection procedures to increase the response rate. They'll probably have some ideas for you. So you do want to keep your committee members and your chair up to date on the progress of your data collection. And then the final thing that I'll go over is special considerations for repeated measures surveys. So a repeated measures survey or study would be if you are giving the participants the surveys and having them fill it out at multiple points in time. So for instance, if you're doing like a pretest and a post-test study where you have participants first fill out the survey as a pretest, and then you give them some kind of intervention, and then maybe a week later, 2 weeks later, or a month later, after the intervention is finished, you give them the survey again as a post-test. In studies like these, you need some way to match each participant's survey responses together. So you need a way to be able to match the pre-test and the post-test responses. And so to do this, you'll need each completed survey to have some kind of identifier or code that lets you know which participant those responses came from. And so you should set up your survey in a way that participants can enter their identifier each time they take the survey, so that their responses will have that identifier attached. And there are different methods that you can use to go about assigning identifiers. Some of them would involve a personal identifier, such as an email address, where, for instance, each time participants take the survey, you can ask them to enter in their email address. And this can serve as an identifier because presumably each participant in your study would have a unique email address. So you'd be able to use that to identify and link their responses together. However, the downside to using a personal identifier is that you're able to identify who the participant is based on that identifier. So if you're trying to keep your survey anonymous, then you can't really use a personal identifier like an email address, because that allows you to personally identify those participants' responses. So it may be preferable, if you want to keep the survey responses anonymous, to use a different type of identifier, like a completely anonymous or a semi-anonymous identifier, such as a researcher assigned code or a participant created code. So you can assign participants a code that they need to enter each time they take the survey, or you can have participants create their own code that they will enter each time they take the survey. And an example of a participant created code might be that you ask the participant to enter their middle initial plus the last 4 digits of their phone number each time they take the survey. And the idea with this is that each code that participants makes will be unique to them. No two participants will have the same code, but it's not enough information to personally identify that participant. So it would be semi-anonymous in the fact that they're creating their own code, but it's not enough information to personally identify them. And so that's an option for linking those surveys together. And then finally, if you are doing surveys at different points in time, you may want to consider creating separate copies or links for the surveys if you're conducting them online, to make sure that you can keep your data organized and know which surveys are the pretest and which surveys are the post-test, or whatever points in time you're using. So if you create a separate survey for the pretest and a separate survey for the post-test, you'll know exactly which responses are for the pretest and which responses are for the post-test. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. Again, here's just some contact information in case you are interested in additional help or more one-on-one help with any issues regarding your dissertation. And with that, I will now go to the questions to see if there are any questions. Okay. All right, it looks like there aren't any questions typed into the question section yet. If you do have questions, use that question section or question box to type in your question. And I'll just go ahead and wait another minute or two to see if we get any questions coming in. Okay, so it looks like I haven't gotten any um, specific questions that have come in. So I'll go ahead and end the session there. Again, thanks everyone for attending today. If you are interested in additional help, you can use the information that you see here to get in touch with us to talk about the additional services that we offer. Otherwise, again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope everyone found this helpful, and I hope everyone has a great day.